Morgan Taylor exhaled with relief as she slid into the window seat in row 14 of the crowded Airbus A320. She had deliberately chosen it, paying extra for the comfort of the view and the peace it provided. The window was her escape, a small sanctuary amid the usual chaos of air travel. With a long flight ahead, she had prepared with a new novel, noise-canceling headphones, and the simple expectation of being left alone. The cabin buzzed with the final movements of boarding passengers. Overhead compartments slammed shut. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, and the familiar pre-flight announcements echoed through the intercom. Morgan adjusted her seatbelt and flipped through the first few pages of her book, allowing the noise around her to gradually fade away. She barely noticed the father and child making their way down the aisle until they stopped right beside her. A deep voice rang out, firm, expectant, a command disguised as a request. "Excuse me, I need your seat," he said. Morgan blinked, looking up. The man standing over her was middle-aged, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than her monthly rent. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, his expensive watch glinted under the fluorescent lights, and his demeanor exuded entitlement, as if he was accustomed to having his demands met without question. Beside him stood a small girl, no older than 6, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. The child had large, anxious eyes and fidgeted with the hem of her pastel cardigan, avoiding Morgan's gaze. Morgan hesitated. "I'm sorry?" she said. The man sighed as if explaining something obvious. He pointed to the empty aisle seat beside her. "My daughter needs the window seat. She gets anxious when flying," he said, his tone allowing no negotiation. Morgan raised an eyebrow. She shifted her gaze between the man and the child. "I'm sorry," she repeated, keeping her tone calm but firm. "I paid for this seat." For a brief moment, Harrison Bennett, she remembered his name from the frequent flyer tag attached to his carry-on, looked genuinely surprised, as if the concept of someone saying no to him was completely foreign. Then, his expression hardened. "It's for a child," he repeated, this time more slowly, as if Morgan hadn't understood him the first time. "Surely you understand." Morgan pressed her lips together. She understood perfectly. She understood that a grown man, who could afford a Rolex and top-grade leather luggage, hadn't anticipated his daughter's needs. She understood that he assumed she would acquiesce without question. And she understood that if she had been someone else, a different age, a different race, his approach might have been different. Still, she kept her tone even. "I understand," she said, "but I also paid for this seat. If it was important, you should have booked accordingly." Harrison's face contracted into a tight, humorless smile. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Then, louder, ensuring those around could hear, a calculated move to make her the problem, he said, "This is what's wrong with people today. No basic kindness." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Passengers nearby awkwardly shifted, some turning their heads, a few glancing at Morgan, their eyes a mix of curiosity and embarrassment. Morgan felt the temperature in her face rising. She knew exactly what he was doing, and it made her stomach clench. But before she could react, a shadow moved into the aisle beside them. A flight attendant had arrived, but what would happen next would surprise everyone. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an uncompromising demeanor, stopped beside them. Her navy blue uniform was crisply pressed. Her name tag read Olivia Reynolds. She glanced between Morgan and the man standing rigidly beside her, sensing the tension like a seasoned referee stepping into a budding conflict. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone calm but resolute. Before Morgan could speak, Harrison Bennett jumped in. Yes, he said, folding his arms. This woman won't give up her seat for my daughter. Olivia's eyebrows furrowed slightly, as if she was waiting for him to continue with the actual problem. Harrison sighed imperiously, then pointed at the child. She gets anxious when flying. She needs a window seat. I asked this young lady to move, but she's refusing. Morgan carefully observed Olivia, looking for any signs of bias or inclination. Flight attendants had a difficult job, balancing customer satisfaction with airline policies, and sometimes that meant yielding to the demands of the loudest passenger. But Olivia didn't look impressed. Her gaze shifted to Morgan. Did you book this seat? Morgan nodded. Yes. Olivia turned back to Harrison. Sir, she has been assigned this seat. Harrison snorted. I know that. I'm asking you to do the right thing and help us resolve this situation. Surely the airline values customer service. Olivia took a deep breath, her patience visibly wearing thin. Sir, customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to leave a seat they've paid for. Harrison's face reddened, but he wasn't giving up easily. This isn't about rules, he said, his voice gradually rising loud enough to attract the attention of surrounding passengers. This is about kindness, about decency, about a grown woman refusing to give up her seat for a child. The way he said it, as if Morgan was some kind of villain, sent a sharp pang through her. However, Olivia remained unfazed. I understand your concern, sir, she said, not budging from his dramatics. If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'd be happy to check if any are available, but I will not ask another passenger to move from their assigned seat. Harrison's jaw clenched. He turned back to Morgan, eyes narrowing. You're really not going to give up your seat for a 6-year-old child? Morgan met his gaze, her voice calm but steadfast. I paid for this seat, she repeated. I'm staying here. Harrison let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. Then, looking around at the other passengers, he raised his voice. Can you believe this? He said to no one in particular. A grown woman refusing to swap seats with a little girl. Murmurs spread throughout the cabin. Some passengers avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to get involved, while others watched with interest, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Morgan felt a wave of discomfort wash over her, not because she doubted her decision, but because this was exactly how people like Harrison operated. He wasn't just trying to get a seat. He was trying to shame her into compliance. And the worst part? It might work. Her hand tightened around her book. She could feel the weight of each stare. The unspoken expectation to be the bigger person. But why was it always her who had to be the bigger person? Olivia must have sensed the shift, because she moved closer to Morgan, a subtle but clear show of support. Sir, she said, her tone low and determined, I'm going to ask you one last time to take your seat. Harrison exhaled forcefully, nostrils flaring, and then he muttered something under his breath. Morgan didn't catch the beginning, but she caught the final word. Typical. Her stomach dropped. Olivia's entire posture changed. She stiffened, lips pressing into a thin line. For a brief moment, the entire row seemed to go silent, as if everyone had heard it. Morgan's heart pounded in her ears. She had heard enough of that word to know exactly what it meant, and so had Olivia. The flight attendant squared her shoulders, her gaze locked onto Harrison. I would advise you to be careful about what you're implying, she said, her tone steely. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The whispers turned into murmurs. But before anything more could be said, another voice joined the conversation. A voice that would change everything. A voice from the row behind cut through the tension. She said she paid for the seat, a man spoke up, his tone calm but resolute. Morgan turned slightly, catching the eye of the speaker. He was middle-aged, wearing a deep blue hoodie and wire-rimmed glasses, sitting in an aisle seat with his arms folded. He wasn't looking at Harrison. He was looking at Olivia, as if expecting her to shut everything down once and for all. Olivia nodded slightly, acknowledging the support, but keeping her focus on Harrison. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice," she said. Harrison exhaled sharply, shaking his head, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. He redirected his frustration toward the developing audience. "This is ridiculous," he said, gesturing around as if searching for allies. "Does no one here think it's wrong for a grown woman to refuse to swap seats with a 6-year-old child?" A few passengers shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, but no one else spoke up. That wasn't good enough for Harrison. "This is what's wrong with society today," he continued, his voice loud enough to echo down the aisle. "People are too selfish, unwilling to do the small thing to help others." Morgan felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, not just because of what he was saying, but because she could feel the implicit pressure he was trying to build around her. She could see it in the way some passengers avoided looking at her directly, the way some hesitated, as if considering his words. It would be so easy for them to side with him, to frame this as a matter of basic kindness, not rights, to make her the villain. Morgan took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I'm not being selfish," she said, her tone calm but steadfast. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else here. If the seating was that important, you should have booked ahead." The man in the blue hoodie nodded slightly, as if satisfied with her answer. Harrison, however, was far from satisfied. "You have no shame, do you?" he muttered, his face flushed with annoyance. Morgan gripped her book, her fingers pressing into the cover, and then a woman sitting across the aisle spoke up. "She's right," the woman said, her voice carrying across the cabin. "Seats aren't randomly assigned. If you wanted a window seat, you should have booked it." Harrison turned his head toward her, his frustration shifting targets. "It's for a child," he repeated, his voice fraying at the edges. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people." Morgan exhaled a soft breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had seen this move before, twisting the situation, making it a moral issue, making it about the bad person refusing to yield to the good person. But something was changing. Now more passengers were looking at Harrison, their expressions ranging from discomfort to visible annoyance. Some were whispering to each other, shaking their heads, and Harrison sensed it. His confidence wavered just a bit, but before he could recover, Olivia stepped forward. "I need you to take your seat now, sir," she said, her tone final. Harrison hesitated. He was losing ground, and he knew it. But before he could regroup, Olivia advanced. "You need to sit down in your seat right now, sir," she said, her tone edged with authority. Harrison faltered. He was losing momentum, and he knew it, but he wasn't ready to give up without one last try. He turned back to Morgan, his voice lower but laced with venom. "You know what? Keep your seat," he said. "I don't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you." Those words hit her harder than she expected. Morgan felt a cold, sharp anger rise in her chest, and she wasn't the only one who noticed it. Olivia's posture stiffened immediately. "That's it," she said, her tone sharp with authority. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Harrison blinked, thrown off balance. "What?" "You can move to your seat right now, or we'll have to speak with the captain." A new kind of tension filled the air, the kind that emerges when someone realizes they've pushed things too far. Harrison opened his mouth, but no words came out. And for the first time since it all began, he looked genuinely uncertain. But uncertainty wasn't the same as surrender, and Harrison Bennett wasn't the type to surrender easily. Something was about to happen. For a moment, Harrison Bennett just stood there, his face contorted between outrage and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. The pushback, the resistance, the sudden turning of the crowd. And now, with Olivia's steady and unwavering voice, the power he thought he had was slipping away. "You want me to go with you?" he repeated, his voice lower now, as if testing how much authority she really had. Olivia didn't blink. "Yes, sir." Morgan could see the change happening before her eyes, the way Harrison's mind was working, calculating his next move. He knew he was in danger of making this situation much worse for himself. But men like him, they don't like to lose. Instead of backing down, he gambled with his final card. "I just find it interesting," he said, his voice rising again, "that you're taking her side. I bet if the roles were reversed, we'd be having a very different conversation." And the air in the cabin thickened. Morgan felt her stomach twist, but she didn't react. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Olivia, however, was done playing. "Sir, I'm warning you," she said, her tone dropping into something colder, sharper. "If you don't sit down right now, I will have to inform the captain, and if that happens, I cannot guarantee you'll remain on this flight." Louder murmurs. Passengers were now watching intently, leaning forward, whispering. And Harrison, he felt it. For the first time, real consequences were looming. He turned, looking toward the cockpit, as if trying to gauge whether Olivia was serious. And then, even worse for him happened. Another voice, another flight attendant, a tall, sturdy man wearing the same navy blue uniform as Olivia, appeared behind her. His name tag read Marcus. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone polite but authoritative. Olivia didn't take her eyes off Harrison. "Not yet, but I've just explained to this gentleman that if he refuses to take his seat, we'll need to escalate the situation." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his presence altered the entire atmosphere of the moment. This wasn't just an argument between a passenger and a flight attendant anymore. It had now become an official matter. Morgan watched the scene unfold, a silent witness to Harrison's internal struggle. He wanted to fight this. Everything in him urged to keep pushing, but now, it wasn't just about pride anymore. Now he was facing the possibility of being ejected from the plane, and that was a step too far. For the first time, his demeanor seemed to weaken slightly. It wasn't complete surrender, but it was acceptance. "Fine," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned, gripping his daughter's hand a bit too tightly, and sullenly made his way toward his seat. A few passengers sighed with relief. Others shook their heads, exchanging knowing looks. Olivia exhaled slowly, regaining her composure before turning back to Morgan. "I'm sorry about this," she said, her tone gentler now. Morgan nodded gratefully. "Not your fault." Olivia hesitated for a moment, then added, "If he bothers you again, let me know immediately." Morgan nodded once more. Olivia and Marcus walked away, disappearing toward the front of the plane. For the first time since it all began, Morgan felt her body relax a little. But just as she was preparing to return to her book, a voice from across the aisle caught her attention. "You handled that really well," the woman with the ponytail said, offering her a small, knowing smile. Morgan breathed out, somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. "I guess so," she said, but the woman shook her head. "No, really. Many people would just move to avoid trouble. You didn't. Morgan didn't answer immediately because, truthfully, she had thought about it. There had been a moment, a real, undeniable moment, when she felt the pressure to yield, to just move, to let it slide, to make things easier. But she hadn't. And now it was over. Or at least she thought it was. But Harrison Bennett wasn't quite finished. Morgan breathed out slowly, adjusting her position in her seat. But the tension in her shoulders didn't ease, even when Harrison had walked away, even when Olivia had made it clear she'd done nothing wrong. There was something about the entire situation that left a bitter taste in her mouth. She glanced toward his seat, 4 rows ahead, on the other side of the aisle. He sat rigid in his seat, arms folded, jaw set. His daughter sat beside him, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes downcast. Morgan felt a flash of something. Perhaps pity, maybe. The little girl hadn't asked for any of this. She was just pulled into her father's mess. But any sympathy she might have had vanished instantly when Harrison turned his head, caught her eye, and smirked. He muttered something Morgan couldn't hear, but she didn't need to. She knew the tone, knew the look, a contemptuous shake of the head as if she was beneath him, as if she was the problem. Ah-chung. She turned back to look out the window, gripping the armrest. She wouldn't let him get to her. She refused. But then he did something she didn't expect. Harrison stood up. Passengers in his row looked up, confused. A flight attendant near the front of the plane immediately noticed. "Sir, I need you to sit down," she said, moving toward him. Harrison didn't listen. He walked right past her, down the aisle toward Morgan. The energy shift was immediate. Passengers turned their heads, eyes following him. Olivia, who had been helping an elderly couple with their luggage, stiffened immediately upon seeing him approach. Morgan didn't move, didn't react, but her heart was racing fast and hard. What the hell was he doing? Harrison stopped at her row, grabbed the seat in front of her, leaned down a bit. The tension was palpable. For a brief moment, it was just the two of them, locked in a silent battle. And then he spoke. "You must be really proud of yourself," he said. Morgan didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Harrison exhaled hard, as if restraining himself. "You sit here, pretending to be the victim," he muttered, his voice just low enough that only she could hear. "But we both know what's really going on." Morgan felt her fingers curl into the armrest. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It never was. This was about control, about ego, about a man who had never been refused before and was being torn apart by it. Morgan opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Olivia's voice rang out. "Sir, step away from the passenger's seat right now." The command sharp, final. Harrison didn't move for a moment. Morgan thought he was going to push it further, escalate into something worse. But then Marcus appeared once more, and this time he didn't ask. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat immediately, we will have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." A collective silence fell over the cabin. Morgan felt the weight of every passenger's gaze. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a spectacle. Harrison's face flushed. For a second, he looked as if he was going to argue, chest expanding, lips parting. But then he made his decision. With a final glare at Morgan, he muttered, "You're unbelievable." Then he turned on his heel and stalked back to his seat. Marcus watched him the entire way. Olivia exhaled. "Are you okay?" Morgan finally breathed out, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm fine," she said, though her hand was still tense. Olivia nodded once, then exchanged a look with Marcus. And then, just as Marcus reached for his radio, Harrison made one final mistake. He muttered something. Not loud enough for the entire plane to hear. Not loud enough for the passengers in front to catch. But loud enough for Olivia and Marcus to hear. Loud enough for Morgan to catch the sharp intake of Olivia's breath. Marcus's expression changed immediately. Marcus didn't hesitate. He brought the radio to his mouth. "Captain, we have a situation." And so Harrison Bennett's flight ended before it even began. The tension inside the cabin was so thick it was suffocating. Passengers stopped whispering, some leaning forward in their seats, others craning their necks to see what would happen next. Marcus's radio crackled. "Copy. Keep him at the front until we can coordinate with ground staff." Morgan's heart pounded. Olivia and Marcus quickly advanced toward Harrison, who was still rigid in his seat, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening. "Sir," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, "I need you to gather your belongings and step into the jet bridge." Harrison didn't react. "Sir?" Olivia tried, giving him one last chance to cooperate. Nothing. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. The little girl beside him clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her eyes darting from her father to the flight attendants. Morgan felt something in her chest. Not sympathy, not pity, but weariness. It should never have gone this far. A seat. It was just a seat. And because a man refused to accept being told no, it had escalated into this. Marcus leaned in. "Mr. Bennett, if you refuse to comply, we will have to call security." That made Harrison take a deep breath, hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up, jaw clenched, shoulders stiff with humiliation. "Let's go," Marcus said, backing up to allow him to pass. Harrison took a step, then hesitated. And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, Morgan thought he was going to turn back and say something to her. But then he just shook his head and walked away. Passengers watched in silence as he was escorted to the front of the plane. Morgan exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Olivia lingered a second longer. "If you need anything, let us know." Morgan nodded. "Thank you," she said. Then the flight attendant turned and followed Marcus to the front. The whispers started the moment they were gone. Passengers whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, some muttering things Morgan couldn't quite make out. But then a voice from across the aisle spoke up. "About time," the woman with the ponytail muttered, shaking her head. A man in the row behind her chuckled low. "He had it coming." A few others nodded in agreement. But Morgan, she just turned back to look out the window, letting the moment sink in. She wasn't proud of what had happened. She wasn't happy about it either. She was just tired, because she knew if she had reacted differently, if she had raised her voice, if she had done anything other than sit quietly and stand her ground, this story might have ended very, very differently. That was the painful part, and for all of it, for all the tension, the confrontation, the humiliation Harrison had tried to impose on her, she regretted nothing. Because in the end, she hadn't moved, and that was enough. This story wasn't just about a man losing his temper over a seat. It was about power, about ego, about how some people will do anything to avoid being refused. And for people like Morgan, saying no, standing firm, refusing to shrink, refusing to yield to pressure, sometimes felt like an act of defiance. But it shouldn't be. Because respect isn't optional. It's not something to be negotiated. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stay right where you are. 2 hours into the flight, Morgan was deep into her novel when a gentle tap on her shoulder pulled her attention away from the page. Looking up, she found Olivia standing in the aisle with a small cup of premium ice cream. "Compliments of the crew," Olivia said with a warm smile. "That can't have been easy." Morgan accepted the ice cream with a surprised laugh. "Thank you, but really, you didn't have to do this." "We wanted to," Olivia replied. "Oh." There was a moment of hesitation before she continued, her voice lowered. "You know, in 15 years of flying, I've seen this happen more times than I can count. People trying to take what isn't theirs, using shame as a weapon." She shook her head. "It's never okay." "What happened to his daughter?" Morgan asked suddenly, realizing she hadn't thought about the child since Harrison was removed. "She's with her mother now. Apparently, they were traveling separately," Olivia explained. "The mother was actually already on board in first class. When we explained what happened, she just shook her head like this was a familiar scenario." Morgan nodded slowly, digesting this new information. "Anyway," Olivia continued, "I should get back to work. Enjoy your flight, Morgan, and your window seat." As Olivia moved away, the man in the blue hoodie from earlier caught Morgan's eye from across the aisle. "Worth standing your ground?" he asked with a knowing smile. Morgan glanced at the ice cream in her hand, and then out at the clouds drifting below. "Always is," she replied. She returned to her book, but her mind lingered on what had transpired. It hadn't been about the seat, not really. It had been about the right to exist in a space she had rightfully claimed, about refusing to be bullied into giving up what was hers simply because someone else felt entitled to it. Some battles, she realized, were worth fighting not for the victory itself, but for what that victory represented. And as she watched the world pass by through her window, that small patch of sky that belonged to her for these few precious hours, she knew she had chosen the right one. The chime of Morgan's phone pulled her attention away from the stack of midterm papers she was grading. A notification from her news app displayed a headline that made her freeze. "CEO of Pinnacle Investments resigns amid allegations of workplace discrimination." The accompanying photo showed a familiar face, Harrison Bennett, looking considerably less composed than he had on the plane, exiting a downtown office building with a grim expression. Morgan clicked on the article, her heart racing as she read. "Harrison Bennett has stepped down as CEO of Pinnacle Investments, following multiple complaints from female and minority employees alleging hostile workplace practices and discriminatory behavior. The company's board initiated an independent investigation after a video went viral showing Bennett berating a black flight attendant on a domestic flight earlier this year." Morgan's breath caught. Someone had recorded the incident. She scrolled down and saw the grainy footage captured by a passenger several rows back. Harrison standing over her seat, Olivia intervening. The subsequent confrontation. The article continued. Former employees have since come forward with their own stories, painting a picture of a toxic workplace environment under Bennett's leadership. "This wasn't isolated behavior," said former executive assistant Layla Washington. "This was who he was every day." Morgan set her phone down, a complex mix of emotions washing over her. She wasn't surprised, not really. She had recognized something in Harrison that day. The practiced entitlement, the casual cruelty, the expectation that the world would bend to his will. She had seen it in classrooms, in meetings, in everyday interactions throughout her life. Her phone buzzed again with a text message from an unknown number. "You probably don't remember me, but I was your flight attendant 6 months ago." Just wanted you to know your moment of standing firm helped others find their voice. Thank you. Olivia Reynolds. Morgan stared at the message, then glanced at the pile of papers on her desk. Essays from her women's studies class on everyday acts of resistance. She picked up her red pen and wrote across the top of her lesson plan for tomorrow. Topic: When small moments create big change. She looked out her apartment window at the city lights below. One woman refusing to give up a seat she'd paid for. One flight attendant refusing to cave to pressure. One person recording what needed to be seen. One by one, small refusals to accept the unacceptable. Sometimes the revolution happens in quiet moments, she thought. Sometimes it happens at 30,000 feet. The story might have ended there, but life has a way of connecting threads we never expected to intersect. 3 weeks after seeing the news about Harrison Bennett, Morgan was invited to speak at a conference on classroom empowerment strategies. She had published a paper incorporating the airplane incident as a case study in her academic work on microaggressions and resistance. After her presentation, a woman approached her, professionally dressed in a tailored suit, with an air of quiet confidence. "Dr. Taylor? I'm Amanda Bennett." Morgan needed a moment to place the name. "Bennett, as in Harrison's ex-wife, yes." Amanda offered a small, knowing smile. "And Emma's mother, the little girl from the plane." Morgan felt her mouth go dry. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Amanda replied, gesturing toward 2 empty chairs in the corner of the conference room. "But I'd like to, if you have a moment." They sat, and Amanda folded her hands in her lap. "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" Morgan echoed, confused. Amanda nodded. "That day on the plane was a turning point for me. I'd been making excuses for Harrison's behavior for years, to our daughter, to myself. When the flight crew explained what happened, something finally clicked." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I filed for divorce the following week. That was actually why we were on separate parts of the plane. We were in the middle of separation proceedings, and Harrison insisted on taking Emma for the weekend." Morgan listened, stunned by how her small act of resistance had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined. "Emma's doing much better now," Amanda continued. "She's in therapy, learning that her anxiety wasn't about flying. It was about her father's unpredictable behavior. She's learning that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary." "I'm glad to hear that," Morgan said sincerely. Amanda reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "I started a foundation supporting women leaving toxic workplace environments. We provide legal assistance, career counseling, and emotional support." She handed the card to Morgan. "I'd love to have you come speak to our group sometime." As Amanda walked away, Morgan turned the card over in her hands. It read, "Reclaim Your Seat Foundation," with the tagline, "Because where you belong is never negotiable." Morgan slipped the card into her wallet with a smile. The world changes not through grand gestures alone, but through countless small moments when people decide enough is enough, when they choose to stay exactly where they belong. And sometimes, that's simply a window seat on an airplane, with the vast sky stretching endlessly beyond. 1 year to the day after the incident, Morgan found herself at LaGuardia Airport, waiting to board a flight to Chicago for an academic conference. She'd just settled into a seat at the gate when her phone buzzed with a notification. "Your flight has been delayed by 45 minutes. We apologize for any inconvenience." Morgan sighed, fishing her book from her bag. Another novel she'd been looking forward to starting. As she opened to the first page, a familiar voice caught her attention. "Dr. Taylor? Morgan Taylor?" Looking up, she found herself face to face with Olivia Reynolds, the flight attendant who had stood by her that day. She was dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a burgundy sweater, her hair loose instead of pulled back in the regulation bun. "Olivia," Morgan stood, genuinely pleased. "What are you doing here?" "Traveling like a normal person for once," Olivia laughed, gesturing to the empty seat beside Morgan. "Mind if I join you? My flight's delayed too." As they settled in, Olivia's expression grew more serious. "You know, I've thought about you often since that day. After what happened with Bennett hit the news, I kept wondering how you were doing." Morgan smiled. "I've been good. Better than good, actually. That moment changed things for me in ways I never expected." She told Olivia about her academic paper, the unexpected meeting with Amanda Bennett, and how she'd begun volunteering with the Reclaim Your Seat Foundation, helping women navigate workplace discrimination. "That's incredible," Olivia said, shaking her head in amazement. "And it all started because you refused to move." "Well, and because you refused to let him bully me," Morgan countered. "What about you? Are you still flying?" Olivia's eyes brightened. "I am, but not as a flight attendant. After the video went viral, I got approached about joining the airline's corporate training division. I now teach conflict de-escalation techniques to new flight crews." She grinned. "I use our incident as a case study, actually." "No way," Morgan laughed. "Me too." "Life's funny like that," Olivia mused. "You know, I've been in aviation for 16 years, and I can't count how many times I've seen people, especially women of color, pressured to give up space they had every right to occupy. Most of the time, they give in just to keep the peace." "I almost did," Morgan admitted. "There was a moment when I thought, maybe I should just move. It would be easier. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." The PA system crackled to life. "Attention passengers of Flight 1422 to Chicago. We're now ready to begin boarding." As they gathered their belongings, Olivia asked, "What seat do you have?" Morgan checked her boarding pass with a smile. 14A, window seat." "Of course it is," Olivia laughed. "Would you want it any other way?" As Morgan joined the boarding line, she reflected on how something as simple as a seat assignment had created such profound change in her life, not just in her career trajectory or the connections she'd made, but in her fundamental understanding of the importance of holding one's ground. She thought about all the people watching that day on the plane. How many of them had gone on to stand up for themselves in moments where they might previously have yielded? How many ripples had spread outward from that one moment of refusal? As she settled into her window seat, Morgan gazed out at the tarmac workers moving efficiently in the fading daylight. She opened her book, but paused, running her fingers over the embossed cover. There was something powerful about the space we claim in this world, whether it's a seat on an airplane or a place at the table where decisions are made. The empty seat beside her was soon filled by a young woman who offered a polite smile as she buckled in. "I hope you don't mind," she said hesitantly, "but I saw you speaking at the Women in Academia conference last month. Your talk about micro-resistance was really inspiring." Morgan turned from the window, pleasantly surprised. "Thank you. I'm glad it resonated." "It did. I turned down a project at work the next day that I would have normally just accepted to keep everyone happy. It was scary, but it felt right." As the plane began to taxi, Morgan thought about how courage creates courage, how seeing someone else stand firm makes it easier to do the same. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and Morgan caught sight of a young black woman confidently directing attention to the emergency exits. She smiled and settled back into her seat. The window beside her framed the runway lights blurring as the plane gathered speed, lifting her once more into the vast, endless sky, a reminder that sometimes the smallest spaces we claim can lead us to the biggest horizons. The unseen observer. What neither Morgan nor Olivia knew was that a young girl had been watching their reunion at the gate with rapt attention. Emma Bennett, now 7 years old, sat clutching her stuffed rabbit, the same one she'd had on that fateful flight, while her mother finished a phone call a few seats away. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when she recognized the woman from the plane, she couldn't help herself. Emma remembered that day clearly, though not in the way adults might expect. She remembered her father's rising anger, the kind that always made her stomach hurt. She remembered the calm lady who wouldn't move, speaking in a voice that never got loud or scary. And she remembered the flight attendant who stood between them, making Emma feel safe even when everything was chaotic. In her 7-year-old mind, that day had taught her something important, that grown-ups who yelled and demanded weren't always right, and that being quiet didn't mean being weak. "Emma, time to board, sweetheart," her mother called, ending her call and gathering their carry-ons. As they walked to their gate, Emma looked up at her mother. "Mom, do you remember the lady who wouldn't give me her seat that time with Dad?" Amanda looked down at her daughter, surprised. "Yes, I do, Dr. Taylor. Why do you ask?" "I just saw her," Emma said, pointing back toward Morgan's gate. "She looked happy." Amanda smiled gently. "I'm glad. She's a good person who helped a lot of people by being brave that day." Emma nodded, processing this in her own way. "I didn't really need the window seat, you know," she confessed. "Dad just said I did." Amanda squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know, sweetie. If I see her again someday, I'm going to tell her thank you," Emma decided, "for not listening to Dad when he was being mean." "That's a lovely thought," Amanda said, her eyes glistening slightly. "Maybe someday you will." As they boarded their own flight, Emma tucked her rabbit under her arm and glanced out the window of the jet bridge. She couldn't see Morgan's plane, but she imagined it somewhere out there, carrying the lady who wouldn't move to wherever she needed to go next. Emma had her own window seat now, one her mother had properly booked ahead of time. As she settled in, she pressed her small palm against the cool glass and made a quiet promise to herself. She would never make someone move just because she could. And someday, when she was grown, she would be brave like the lady on the plane. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes, the smallest witnesses to our moments of courage are the ones who carry those lessons the furthest into the future. The plane accelerated down the runway, and Emma watched the ground fall away as they climbed into the clouds. Somewhere in the vast sky, another plane carried Morgan Taylor and her enduring legacy of quiet resistance, a legacy that had already taken root in one small girl's heart. And that, class, is why intersectionality matters in our everyday interactions, Morgan concluded, closing her presentation slides. The lecture hall was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. It was the final session of her graduate seminar on power dynamics in social contexts, and Morgan had just finished sharing the full story of the airplane incident, now a cornerstone case study in her curriculum. As students gathered their belongings, a young woman approached the podium, waiting patiently while Morgan answered questions from other students. When the others had departed, she stepped forward. "Professor Taylor? I'm Zoe Washington. I'm actually not in your class. I'm from the law school, but my friend suggested I sit in today." She shifted nervously from one foot to the other. "Your story really resonated with me." Morgan smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that, Zoe. Was there something specific that stood out to you?" "Everything, really," Zoe admitted. "But especially how you talked about the calculation. That moment when you weighed whether it would be easier to just give in." She hesitated. I'm in the middle of filing a discrimination complaint against one of my professors, and every day I wonder if I should just drop it. It would be easier. Morgan nodded, understanding completely. It usually is easier to give in, at least in the short term. But you didn't, Zoe pointed out. No, I didn't. Morgan gathered her notes, considering her next words carefully. You know, one thing I've learned from studying hundreds of these incidents is that the pressure to yield isn't random. It's systematically applied to certain groups more than others, and the social consequences for resistance are unevenly distributed. Zoe nodded vigorously. Exactly. When women of color stand firm, we're difficult, and when white men do it, they're principled. Which is precisely why sometimes not moving is the most powerful move you can make, Morgan said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Not her academic one, but one with the Reclaim Your Seat Foundation logo. If you need support with your complaint, these people can help. Zoe accepted the card, studying it closely. Thank you, Professor. I think I needed to hear your story today. After Zoe left, Morgan lingered in the empty lecture hall, thinking about how her small stand on that airplane had evolved into her life's work. In the 3 years since the incident, she'd published 2 papers on the psychology of entitlement, secured tenure partly on the strength of her research into micro-resistance strategies, and helped the Reclaim Your Seat Foundation expand to 3 new cities, all because she had refused to move. As she packed the last of her materials, her phone buzzed with a notification from her airline app, her flight confirmation for next week's conference in Denver. Seat 14A. Window. Some things never changed. And that was exactly as it should be. Mom, over here! Morgan turned at the sound of her daughter's voice, spotting her waving enthusiastically from a cafe table near the airport bookstore. At 53, Morgan moved with the same purposeful stride she always had, though gray now threaded elegantly through her braids. Sorry I'm late, she said, setting down her carry-on and embracing her daughter. Security was a nightmare. No worries, Jasmine replied, pushing a coffee across the table. I ordered your usual, strong enough to stand up for itself, just like its drinker. Morgan laughed at their family joke. Very funny. How's the dissertation coming along? Almost finished, Jasmine beamed. My committee loved the chapter that uses your airplane story as a framing device for generational responses to microaggressions. I still can't believe that old story has legs after all these years, Morgan mused, sipping her coffee. Are you kidding? It's practically legend in academic circles now, especially since your book hit the bestseller list. Morgan smiled, still slightly embarrassed by the success of The Window Seat, how small acts of resistance change the world. What had begun as an academic analysis had resonated far beyond university walls, striking a chord with readers around the globe. As they chatted, Morgan noticed a woman at a nearby table glancing their way repeatedly. She was in her late 20s, professionally dressed with a laptop open in front of her. After a few minutes, the woman stood and approached their table. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. You're Dr. Morgan Taylor, aren't you? Morgan nodded, accustomed to being recognized since her book tour. I am. I thought so, the woman said, then took a deep breath. My name is Emma Bennett. Morgan's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Emma? Harrison Bennett's daughter? Emma nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. The very same. Oh, please join us, Morgan said, gesturing to an empty chair. Jasmine looked between them, immediately understanding the significance of the moment. I've wanted to meet you properly for a long time, Emma said, as she sat down. Though I suppose we've already met, in a manner of speaking. You were very young, Morgan acknowledged. I'm not sure it counts. It counts, Emma assured her. More than you know. She fidgeted with her watch, a habit, not a nervous tic. I never got to thank you. Thank me? For what? For teaching me one of the most important lessons of my life, Emma said simply. I watched you that day. How calm you remained even when my father tried to intimidate you. I didn't have the vocabulary for it then, but I recognized dignity when I saw it. Morgan was momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence for the now renowned professor and speaker. My mother says that day was a turning point for both of us, Emma continued. For her, it was the catalyst to leave an unhealthy marriage. For me, she paused, gathering her thoughts. Well, I grew up determined to be nothing like my father. I became a civil rights attorney. I specialize in workplace discrimination cases. Jasmine leaned forward, intrigued. That's amazing. It's funny how life works, Emma said. Last month I was going through some old case files for research, and I came across a familiar name, Olivia Reynolds. The flight attendant? Morgan asked, surprised. Emma nodded. She filed a discrimination suit against the airline 7 years after your incident. They tried to demote her after she reported harassment from a senior executive. My firm represented her. I had no idea, Morgan said. We lost touch after running into each other at the airport that one time. Well, she won her case, Emma said with pride. It established an important precedent about retaliation claims that's still cited today. She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, Morgan's book, and placed it on the table. Would you mind signing this? It's not just for me. I teach a workshop for young women entering male-dominated fields, and your story is part of our curriculum. As Morgan signed the book, a boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Emma checked her watch and stood. That's my flight. Thank you for your time, Dr. Taylor. And thank you for not moving that day. After Emma departed, Jasmine shook her head in amazement. And you claim your story doesn't have legs? Morgan watched Emma's retreating figure disappear into the crowd. I never could have imagined where that moment would lead. Isn't that the point of your book, though? Jasmine asked. That we never know how far the ripples will travel when we choose to stand our ground? Morgan smiled at her daughter, this brilliant young woman who had grown up hearing the window seat story as both bedtime tale and life lesson. I suppose it is. As they gathered their belongings to head to their respective gates, Morgan reflected on the long arc that had begun with that simple refusal on an airplane. A career built, a movement joined, lives changed, including her own. The world was still far from perfect. Entitlement and prejudice hadn't magically disappeared, but in classrooms and courtrooms, in workplaces and on airplanes, people were standing their ground in ways both small and significant. Morgan had played her part, holding space not just for herself that day, but for all who would come after. And somewhere above the clouds, in seat 14A, another passenger was perhaps at this very moment discovering the power of saying, "No, this space is mine. I paid for it. I'm staying here." The simplest acts of courage often cast the longest shadows. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as students, faculty, and visitors found their seats. The annual Resistance and Resilience Conference had become one of the most anticipated events in the field of social justice studies, drawing participants from around the world. Dr. Jasmine Taylor, now a tenured professor herself, adjusted the microphone at the podium and smiled at the packed room. Welcome everyone to our keynote panel. Today marks the 30th anniversary of what has become known in academic circles as The window seat incident, a seemingly small moment of resistance that has become a cornerstone case study in how individual actions can spark collective change. She gestured to the three women seated on stage. I'm honored to moderate this discussion between three remarkable women whose lives were forever changed by a single confrontation on an airplane. Please welcome Dr. Morgan Taylor, Ms. Emma Bennett, and Ms. Olivia Reynolds. The audience erupted in applause as the three women acknowledged the welcome. At 73, Morgan's hair was now completely silver, but her posture remained upright, her gaze sharp and engaged. Emma, in her mid-30s, had established herself as one of the country's foremost civil rights attorneys. Olivia, elegant in her 60s, had recently retired after a distinguished career in corporate ethics training. I'd like to begin, Jasmine continued once the applause subsided, by asking each of you to reflect on how that day changed the trajectory of your lives. Mom, Dr. Taylor, would you start us off? Morgan leaned toward her microphone. I never intended to become a symbol or start a movement. I just wanted to keep the seat I'd paid for. This drew knowing laughter from the audience, but that moment forced me to articulate something I'd always felt but never fully expressed, that the constant pressure on marginalized people to accommodate, to make ourselves smaller, to give way, is itself a form of oppression. Standing my ground that day became the foundation of my academic work and activism. Jasmine nodded, then turned to Emma. Ms. Bennett, you were only 6 years old when this happened. How did witnessing that confrontation affect you? Emma adjusted her glasses. I think children often understand more than adults realize. What I witnessed that day was a collision between two worldviews. My father's belief that his desires automatically outweighed others' rights, and Dr. Taylor's quiet insistence on her own dignity. That contrast shaped my understanding of justice in ways I'm still unpacking. And Ms. Reynolds, Jasmine continued, as the flight attendant who intervened, what perspective can you offer? Olivia straightened in her chair. In my 30 years as a flight attendant, I saw countless passengers, particularly women of color, give up their rightful spaces rather than face confrontation. That day, I decided I wouldn't be complicit in that pattern anymore. It cost me professionally at first, but ultimately led to policy changes that protected both passengers and crew. For the next hour, the three women discussed how their individual experiences connected to broader movements for equality and respect. They answered questions about micro-resistance strategies, the power of allies, and the unexpected ways that standing one's ground could create space for others to do the same. As the session drew to a close, a young woman approached the microphone during the Q&A. My question is for all three of you. What would you say to someone who feels that standing firm isn't worth the backlash it might bring? The three women exchanged glances, each considering the question. It was Emma who finally spoke. I'd say that the calculus isn't always about immediate outcomes. When Dr. Taylor refused to move that day, she couldn't have known how it would affect me, or my mother, or the millions who've now read her book. Sometimes we stand firm, not because we know it will change the world, but because refusing to be diminished changes us. Morgan nodded in agreement. There's a cost to resistance, certainly, but there's also a cost to compliance, to the constant yielding of space, dignity, and rights. That cost is paid not just by us, but by everyone who comes after us. Olivia added the final thought. And remember, you're never as alone as you feel in those moments. For every person openly challenging the status quo, there are many more silently gathering courage from your example. After the panel, as attendees mingled at the reception, a university archivist approached with an unusual request. She carried a preservation box containing a worn stuffed rabbit. "Ms. Bennett, we've been curating an exhibit on objects that witnessed historical turning points. Your mother donated this, saying it was with you on the flight that day. Would you be willing to share its story for our collection?" Emma took the stuffed rabbit, running her fingers over its faded fur. "His name is Courage," she said softly. "I renamed him after that flight." Later, as Morgan, Emma, and Olivia posed for a photograph together, Morgan marveled at how their three lives, once connected by chance and conflict, had become intertwined in purpose. "Who would have thought," Olivia said, echoing Morgan's thoughts, "that a dispute over a window seat would lead to all this?" "I think that's the point," Emma replied. "The most significant changes often begin in the most ordinary moments, when someone simply decides this far and no further." As the conference concluded, attendees departed with renewed commitment to their own forms of resistance, large and small. The story of the window seat had become more than an anecdote or case study. It had become a template for recognizing how power operates in everyday interactions and how it can be reclaimed. And somewhere, on another airplane, another person was perhaps at this moment choosing to stand their ground, unaware of how far the ripples might travel from that single, quiet act of courage. For Morgan Taylor, that was perhaps the most meaningful legacy of all. Not the books or the accolades or even the policy changes, but the countless unnamed people who had learned to say, "No, I belong here. I'm staying right where I am." Some stories never truly end. They just keep finding new storytellers.